I think we are online.
Yes.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is André Guimarães. I'm the Executive Director of EPAM, the Amazonian Environmental Research Institute. It's an honor to be here to talk about the Amazon with you. This is the second broadcast event of the project Amazon ER. Amazon ER is an initiative of debates and discussions live on the internet through YouTube. We are now in the second debate of the Amazon ER project. We'll have another 4, so the total of 6 debates every 15 days, every 2 weeks. We'll have this debate. The Amazon ER program, friends, is an initiative to promote the dialogue about the Amazon. The Amazon is a centerpiece in the climate change efforts, is a centerpiece in supplying water to the Brazilian agriculture that supplies food for more than 1 billion people every day. It's a centerpiece in the quality of life of people living in the Amazon. So for all of those reasons, in addition to being the depository of the equivalent to 10 years of human global carbon emissions, so the Amazon is a centerpiece in the puzzle of dealing with climate change. This series of workshops are discussing the Amazon, but in the context of the EU-Mercosur agreement, soon to be, hopefully, the EU-Mercosur agreement, which will, of course, increase the trade amongst these two continents, will increase the consumption, increase the demand for products. In other words, will increase the demand for production. Being Brazil a key player in the agribusiness sector, in the agricultural sector, it seems very important for this country and for the world to protect the Amazon. But in order to protect the Amazon, we need to talk about the Amazon. We need to understand in depth what is it that the Amazon has to offer to the world, and how can we benefit the Amazon from the global interests. So that's where Amazon ER is positioned. And I'm glad to have here 2 very good friends of mine. Paulo Barreto. Paulo Barreto is a senior scientist at Amazon, good friend since, well, I'm not telling Paulo because this is going to give up our ages, but we've been friends for a long time. And Paulo Barreto has been working on doing research, looking at the engagement of stakeholders to accomplish growth of protected areas, reduction of illegal logging, reduction of deforestation. Paulo has a Master's of Science, Forest Science at Yale University, and has produced more than 100 articles that would promote the discussion about forestry, cattle ranching, environmental law, policy, and the drivers of deforestation. Thank you very much, Paulo, for joining us here today. We also have Jan Lohans. Jan is a very good friend also. Jan works for IDRI in France. He's the leader of efforts of IDRI on biodiversity. We've been talking for quite a bit now about the EU-Mercosur agreement. Jan has been a good partner in helping us to understand the dynamics of this EU-Mercosur agreement. He holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Paris, Panthéon-Sorbonne. His career has been divided between research, environmental consulting firms, and administration. So it's a pleasure to have you here with us, Jan. Thank you very much for joining. So let's take advantage of this time together, and I'm here to moderate this debate. As I said, it's going to be focused on the EU-Mercosur agreement, in learning about the implications for the Amazon. But today we're going to talk about one specific aspect of potential implications of the agreement, which is in the beef industry. So the question that we are trying to debate here today is, what is the potential impact of the EU-Mercosur agreement on the meat chain in the Amazon? There will be more demand, consequently more pressure for development, for deforestation eventually. And let me start with you, Paulo. I know that you've just launched an analysis report that analyzes the potential impacts of the trade agreement in the deforestation levels in the Amazon. And well, I read the abstract, and it tells us that it may increase the deforestation, and that's something that we don't want to happen. So could you tell us more about the report, Paulo, and position us on what you found during this study? Paulo Barreto, please.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, for the invitation, for the meeting. Yeah, we launched the report today. The title of the report is the agreement deforestation proof. The agreement was signed in principle, and it says that it's going to manage to mitigate the risk of deforestation because it contains provisions to manage such risks. And I put a team together, me and researchers at the universities in the US, to evaluate the agreement. Both what are the risks of deforestation, where this deforestation is likely to happen, and if the agreement has the proper provisions to avoid deforestation. So what I will share here are the results of that analysis. I hope everybody can see that. It's moving.
Yeah, we can see, Paulo. Thank you.
Yeah, so one part of the study was to review the former experiences. And I found this article was published this year showing that trade agreements indeed increase deforestation. They evaluated agreements from 2001 to 12. So there is a short spike of deforestation after the agreements are enacted. And this happens, so during 3 years after the agreements are put in place, there is this sharp increase of deforestation. And we found with our study that evaluated several scenarios. Yes, there is additional risk of deforestation. It can reach 243,000 hectares in the region. Most of this risk is likely to be in Brazil. You see that in yellow there, because of the land area, the amount of production. So on average, in all the scenarios, 55% of the deforestation will tend to be in Brazil. The other part of the analysis is where this deforestation is likely to be. You see in this map, in the Amazon, the red is where most of the risk is. So yes, cattle ranch is the main driver of deforestation in Brazil. 96% of the deforestation in Brazil happens in the Amazon biome. In the other biome, the Cerrado. So there is also risk of deforestation there. We also look at if deforestation happens in those regions, if there will be a special impact on indigenous lands, protected areas. And we find that this risk can actually be close to several protected areas and indigenous lands. So this adds additional concern, given that because of the discourse that the current government has using, people are invading, occupying more indigenous lands and increasing conflicts. This would also may happen in the Cerrado. And up to now, what we have is that Brazil has been unable and unwilling to mitigate the risk of deforestation. The government has reduced enforcement, civil society participation, is also attempting to undermine indigenous land rights, and with proposals in Congress that actually benefit land grabbers. So it is an additional concern. What we found also by reviewing the agreement is that it doesn't provide the proper regulation. One main aspect of that, the way that the agreement works is that it doesn't offer sanctions if there is non-compliance with the rules. There is also very limited space for civil society participation. And the process to address non-compliance is very slow, 406 days to reach a conclusion about this. So in that scenario, the main conclusion is that this agreement should not be ratified as it is. It should demand actually the reduction of deforestation, but actual money, new money to help in funding reduction of deforestation and increase the space for civil society participation. So there's a kind of three main messages in terms of recommendations. I will stop here. You have more space and I can say more depending on the questions. Thanks.
Excellent, Paulo. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So let me go to you now, Jan. Well, as Paulo said, I mean there's a risk of increasing deforestation, and that we know is something very important for the European markets, for the European countries and population. Uh, what's your take, Jan, on this? If you could just tell us a little bit about your perception from Europe of the agreement itself, and what is it, the perception of this risk, and how can we mitigate eventually this kind of risk? Jan, please.
Yes, thank you, Paulo, André, and Paulo. Yes, some facts maybe about the agreement that we need to have in mind when we consider what will happen with this agreement and what we can do with it to help a sustainable development. The first thing is that it's what is called an association agreement. That is, it's more than a trade agreement. It's an agreement that says that the two units, the European Union and the Mercosur Union, will cooperate on policy, let's say, on environmental and economic policy. So it's much more than a free trade agreement, at least in terms of principles. But it has a first consequence is that it means, in the case of association agreements, that you need the unanimity of all European countries. The 27 has to agree upon the agreement, which is, of course, much more difficult to reach than when it's only a qualified majority. That's the first thing to know. Second, it's, of course, a big agreement for the EU because Mercosur is big, Brazil is big, and the unit is big. The fact that, and that's one of the biggest, let's say, in terms of economic units that the EU is considering today. However, of course, there is some strong asymmetry between the two units because first, the European market is rather open right now. The tariffs are quite low in general, whereas they are quite high in Mercosur countries. So the difference, let's say, in terms of lowering tariffs would be quite higher for you than it would be for the Europeans. Second, it's a very big economy because it's of course a big number of people and they are rather rich, which means that the impact on the European market of the imports from Mercosur would be something usually under 1% of the market. When we talk about meat, for example, we'll talk about again, but it might be bigger for you because the Europeans the European economy is bigger. So the impact on the share, on the market share that are in Brazil and Argentina, Uruguay and Paraguay might be bigger. The idea is, of course, as you know, a general dismantlement of tariffs, which again concerns a lot Mercosur, much more than EU, but it's also a deal that increases the quotas that Brazil, Argentina, the Mercosur countries will be able to sell in terms of beef and poultry, plus additional quotas on sugar, ethanol, etc. But that's more or less the idea of this agreement: dismantlement of tariffs on industrial products, dairy products, some processed food products, and of course yes, cars and services, in exchange for an increase of imports from agro-food products, with a trade and sustainable development chapter that supposedly provides guarantees that things are going on the right way with respect to environment. And I would not expand on that because Paulo has mentioned that this chapter is rather weak in terms of obligations. It's a very good chapter and methodology for countries that are really willing to imply a sustainable development policy, but it does not provide any obligation if you are not willing to. It includes an acknowledgement of the Paris Agreement on climate change. The parties will agree to carry on, but there is no sanctions about that. It's something that say we commit, let's say, to stay in the Paris Agreement, but there is no sanctions. Likewise, there is the recognition of the precautionary principle as something we might consider. We have to consider, but not again with sanction. Now to come more directly to the impact on the meat chain, which is the subject of this evening. This evening for me, this afternoon for you in Brazil. This will depend first on something that's very difficult to assess, which is the rise in quotas that Brazil, Argentinians, Uruguayans, and Paraguayans will be able to sell to the EU. Because when we say, for example, you can go from this amount number A to amount number B of quota, you are not necessarily going to use the whole difference. It will depend very much on how much you are using today your quota. If you are not using 100% of the quota, then it means that raising this quota will not increase your exportations. So you need to know what will actually be the increase in meat exports from Brazil, for example. You need to know for each quota of kind of meat, kind of beef, frozen, chilled, cooked, and different types of quotas. You need to know how today they are used, and then make a calculation about that. We've done that calculation. It was very difficult to know because you need to know the different years, the amount sold by which countries on which kind of products. And we came to the conclusion that more or less it should be 53,000 tons more than today. But what's important is that to remember that the majority would come from Argentina. An important. I can share maybe some figures I have here, which is here. Yes, from the report we have drafted for the French government. You can see it's in French. So very sorry, but you have the amounts here: Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And you have the different lines and then the tables are the types of beef meat: frozen, réfrigéré is frozen. Congelé réfrigéré is chilled, congelé is frozen, then cuit is cooked. And you see here in 1,000 tons how much the different countries will sell more. It says that it should be 25,000 tons for Argentina, 24 for Brazil, 2.7 for Paraguay, and 1 for Uruguay. So that's one thing to know for that. No, the problem, of course, is to assess how much this increase of meat will actually mean deforestation. Of course, the reasoning is not straightforward because Brazilian, for example, produce a lot of meat on something else than forest, of course, on pastures and on land which is not forest anymore and hasn't been forest for a long time. And the size of the Brazilian herd is so big that you would need only a slight increase in productivity to be able to sell this more without any need for surface. But today, as Paulo has mentioned, today, cattle is still the major factor one of the major factors for deforestation in Brazil and in Argentina as well, in the Chaco, which is some equivalent to the Cerrado. So there is a risk. I mean, if you buy more meat, to people that today are using this part of this meat to produce something that's deforestation, then there is a risk. So the issue is there something in the agreement that prevents from this risk? As we said, the chapter that provides guarantees is rather weak, let's say. Second, of course, as we all know, the current policy of Brazil regarding the implementation of its own forest code is rather weak as well. And last, the meat industry in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay is not fully traceable. That is, we know where a cow comes from, but only from the last farm before the slaughterhouse. So there is a possibility that the cow is born somewhere in the Amazon and then taken to another farm, which is not in the Amazon, and then sold to the European market without anyone knowing that this cattle has been raised somewhere else. That's because the traceability is not full. In Europe or in Uruguay, traceability is full. That is from the birth of the calf, of the young cattle, to the slaughterhouse. You know where it is from, how, and even you know more. You know how healthy they were, what kind of treatment they received, etc. In Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, this is not happening. So it's the third possibility to have a guarantee that is not provided today by the industry. It might improve in the future, but today it's not provided. Which means that there is a risk. There is no certainty, definitely no certainty that the amount of meat that would be sold in addition, thanks to the EU-Mercosur agreement, would come from forests. There is no certainty, but there is no guarantee on the opposite that it would not come from the forest. If the governmental policy was strong against deforestation, if we had strong traceability, and if we had a strong sustainable development chapter, we could say, well, we can be pretty sure that this meat is not going to be a risk, which is not the case today, which is why we consider there is a risk and something should be done before signing the agreement to reduce this risk or even suppress it. And I've tried to calculate it, what is the maximum risk in terms of surface, and the maximum risk of the very part of the meat that would be bought by the Europeans is 700,000 hectares more. That is, if you take the meat that you need you would sell, you transform that meat into cattle, and you put that cattle on land, on new land, you will need 700,000 hectares, which is 5%. Which is if this was totally deforestation, it would mean 5% deforestation more than today. And that's all. That's because I only take in consideration the fact that Europeans buy only 20% of a cattle, of a carcass, because the European market is the one that buys the highest price, what's called the prime cut, the best part of the cattle. The rest is being sold either on the market, on the Brazilian market, or to other countries, especially China. If you consider the whole cattle, not only the part that is sold to Europe, but the whole cattle that is being bred to produce that meat, then it would be 5 times more, 5 times surface more. So the risk would be higher. But in that case, it would not be the sole responsibility of the EU-Mercosur agreement. It would be the responsibility of the whole market increase. So that's what I wanted to say in relation with this meat and Amazon and deforestation and Mercosur agreement question today.
Excellent, Jan. So it's very clear, and I like the way you put it, because this is seen as a trade agreement, but it has actually 3 dimensions. It has the trading, has the political, and has the cooperation dimension, which and I like the third one, because the third one maybe can offset the risks that you've just described. If we do engage in a cooperation to identify the problems, to make sure that eventually traceability is in place and comfortable for both sides. So I think there's an enormous demand for dialogue and in building this process. And I really wish to have more participation of the civil society in this process, which is what we are actually talking about here today, so that we can learn more. So thank you, Jan. Let me go back to you, Paulo. We have a problem. We have a problem. We have a potential to increase our markets, our sales into international markets. Brazil is known as an agricultural powerhouse, but as you've said, and also Jan pointed, there's a risk there, that there's a risk of leakage, let's put it this way. There's a risk that this trade agreement derives into more deforestation and so on, as you've pointed, Paulo. You've been studying cattle raising in the Amazon for a long time. How can we deal with that? I mean, is that a solvable problem? And what's your take on this? How can we direct the process in a way that it's transparent enough, that makes our clients comfortable, and at the same time, increase the production, the income in Brazil without deforestation? What would be your take on this, Paulo?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a combination of market and also public policies. when you look at the past, Brazil was able to implement successfully several policies, including cooperation and tension from market and public policy. Brazil from 2005 to 2012 reduced deforestation by 83%. And this resulted in the largest reduction of greenhouse gases in the world. So it was Brazil was really a champion in that sense. But after that, Brazil started weakening the environmental policies, either by changing laws or by reducing the execution of the laws, basically, if you think about enforcement. But one result we got from that period, we know from personal experience and by study and several papers showing what happened when the Brazilian government was tough against deforestation. The rangers say, well, it's riskier now to deforest. What I'll do? Well, I have lots of land that are underutilized. So you see the data showing that they invested to increase land use productivity. So they hired people to improve the techniques, they trained people, they invested in the infrastructure. I followed ranchers doing this here in Pará State. So we see this happening, and we see also the data. So it's possible, provided that we have this combination of the policy and the response from the private sector. And I would say that now there is some more components in favor of that scenario. If the government is playing along, which is having more the finance sector supporting that transition. In the past, we had the ranchers and the farmers doing that by themselves. But now with the risk increasing for the finance sector, now they know that climate change is real. They study, they see the data from the insurance companies that the risk the events are increasing. This is leading to losses and also pressure from consumers. So they are more now willing to be part of cooperation. So you see in Brazil, the 3 largest private banks now engaged in a cooperation regarding sustainable development in the Amazon. So I would say that part of the private sector is more mature to do that, but we still have these laggards in the ranching sector, especially. And for that sector, we need public policy, the enforcement side. And this is what we are lacking. So I think there is a space to go forward. I think the agreement could be an opportunity, provided that Europe and other buyers are tough and say, yes, we believe that is possible, but you have to really show results. And this is going to facilitate, to speed up that transition. That we began last time. We got lost, I could say in the way. But I think this is, the pressure is mounting. People are start talking about not buying from Brazil or not invest in Brazil. And this is one important point that I brought. It's not a matter of agriculture products only, the agreement. This may have an impact on investing. Soon after the agreement was signed, a lot of banks got together to discuss, well, that's a big opportunity, what we are going to do, right? So that was a very interesting to see the banking sector see this as an opportunity. So by continuing supporting deforestation, Brazil risks more than just the agribusiness sector, becomes a kind of systemic risk for the whole economy. And some economists in Brazil that work with government, the head of the central bank has already said that we need to improve our environmental standards and performance to have investment. So I think we are almost there, but we need to change the mindset of some key people that are the most important that make decisions about how to enforce law.
Very interesting, Paul. I totally agree. I think we are in the middle of a silent revolution. And it's very common to go to the field, and you've certainly heard that from ranchers in the Amazon, that they used to say, Jan, that, well, I'm doing these activities as my father did, as my grandfather did, as my grandfather did. I mean, oh my God, you're doing the same thing as your family has been doing for 100 years. I mean, at least that is of a little bit of concern. I mean, to be repeating the same model, which is an expansionist model, which has to stop, and has to stop for reputational reasons, as we've heard from both of you. But it also has to stop for practical reasons. Otherwise, we're not going to have the water that we need to irrigate our agriculture for the future. So for a number of reasons, this is an issue that has to be dealt with urgency. And in that sense, Jan, let me fly back to Europe again and ask you this question. IDRI has recently issued a report on greening trade agreements, and you've probably studied in depth these challenges, and you know, as we are discussing here, this trade agreement, of course, has this dimension of increasing the trade and benefiting people with better goods and services and so on. But you know, how can we expect that a trade agreement like the EU-Mercosur can help or can serve as a lever for greening the economy of these countries? And I'd like to hear your thoughts, particularly on the cooperation angle of the trade agreement. Jan, please.
Indeed, it would be, let's say, rather new, because up to now, trade agreements were not made to support sustainable development policies. They were not against it, but they were not a sustainable development instrument. They were made to increase trade and growth, and they did their job. And so today, what is asked is that somehow we change our perspective from all sides of the world to not consider trade as a final end, but as a means to support development that would be sustainable in all parts of the world. And so that would be new, and that's why it's not so easy to actually implement these kind of things. Of course, and I think you're right. The main resource in this agreement would be very probably in the fact that it's not only a trade agreement; it's an association agreement. I think that it's impossible to just to ask for a renegotiation of the whole agreement. I mean, the Brazilians, Mercosur people, plus the European DG Trade have taken 20 years of negotiations. They've done a terrible horse trading of this amount against this one. It's like a very complicated system. That is, if you take away one piece, because you say, for example, we are going to decrease the quota in meat for 10,000 tons, then there are another provision that has been negotiated against that one. You will need to retract, etc. So my idea would rather be, let's keep the deal as it is in terms of quantities, tariffs, and quotas. But then let's add a new layer of agreement, some kind of second agreement regarding our cooperation between the two units with respect to two things. One is what can we cooperate on to make our industries, not your only industry, but all industries, including the European ones, more sustainable? How can we cooperate for that? And of course, second is what kind of guarantees can we produce to make sure that these trade agreements are a way to empower the people in both units, again, in EU as in Mercosur, the people that are in charge of sustainable development. Today, it's not the case. Today, there is a very small role for the civil society. There is a role, of course, but it's rather limited. And one way would be to increase the role of elected representatives, of civil society organizations, NGOs, cities, mayors, you name it, to take part of the policy discussion. And that has to come through a cooperation part of the agreement. And of course, there could be also in that some exchange of funds and investments. It could be some kind of investment agreement, saying, well, you will need investment for having a more sustainable development. We can provide. I don't know who's the we. It's not me. I don't have money for that. But but somebody could probably invest in that, and that might be interesting. Think of this modernization, let's say, of the meat industry that you can eat. Or think also that Brazil has an enormous potential in terms of degraded land that is not currently used for producing products, agricultural products, that could be put to use without destroying the forest or other ecosystems, because it's old deforestation. So why not use using the old deforestation, the previous deforestation, for that? So maybe many things are possible that way. And last, of course, for the future trade agreements that all countries should sign, the idea is to consider them not only as a growth and economic instrument, but also as a diplomatic instrument. If you want access to my markets, this is what I suggest that you do. And conversely, for both sides, which is also important. I would, for example, suggest that the Brazilians would say, okay, you don't want any kind of meat from us, but maybe we don't want any kind of car from you. Maybe something could be done in terms of differentiating the types of tariffs that we are going to lower according to how sustainable the imports from EU are going to be. If it's things that are going to help development and sustainable development in Brazil, that's good. If it's not, well, it could be discussed. So the discussion could be symmetrical across the two units, saying what we don't want and what we want to see in our future trade relations.
Excellent, Jan. Indeed, this trade agreement has a potential to break paradigms and to start a new era of relationship between nations and regions, and which go beyond trade. And that's the expectation we have. I have a very interesting question that I would like to hear both of you, beginning with Paulo, that is coming from the audience, but I would like to hear both of you's takes on this one. The question is from Marta Fellows, Marta Fellows Dorado. She's a researcher at IPAM. What do you consider most efficient, to track the producer or the product, or to invest in data to inform the consumer? What would you say, Paulo? This is intriguing. Again, to track the producer or to invest in data to inform the consumer? You can say both, but please do justify.
Well, the consumers, I think part of the consumers are willing to demand better practices. But the research that we have, at least not from Amazon, but from that we see on the market, it shows that about 20% of the consumers are willing to pay attention and to take some action. So I don't think that you have time to convince all the individual consumers to change. I think it's more important to change the behavior of the companies, because they are the kind of the nodes of the the gates of the market, people that finance. And these big companies, they have already made big commitments. They have signed the letters and pledges and everything. So I think in terms of a strategy, it's easier to demand from them to adopt the best practices, which include, of course, implementing traceability and other measures. And of course, there are several ways to implement traceability, individual tracing with each cattle. But maybe there are ways that are easier just based on land maps, for example. Yeah, but I think focusing on the I would say the gatekeepers, right? I say that we have about 100 companies operating in Brazil, in the Amazon with the beef, right? The meat packing companies. And they have 170 plants. So 100 companies. So these 100 companies, they shape the behavior of 500,000 ranchers, right? So they are, I say they are the gates of the farm, of the Amazon farm. So, and I say, for those that like soccer, we would need 6 or 7 Macarena stages to have all the ranchers to dialogue, or you can go to our auditorium with 100 managers and say, guys, let's do it, right? So I think it's easier to address the issue of focusing on the gatekeepers. That is basically the, and if you go to finance, is even less, right? 10 people, we can solve the problem. So my strategy is to focus more on who are the most powerful in that operation.
Transparency. Jan, what would be your take on this?
I think I would agree with Paulo on short term. I think on the long term, we will need some product traceability. Why? Because there is in the issue, there is an issue of reputation. That is, eventually you need that the consumers are trusting the products. If they don't, and even then if the producer has made efforts, they will turn their back to the products. I can take the example of palm oil in Europe. It's been years of campaigning by the NGOs, and producers of palm oils have waited somehow to address the sustainability concerns, and know that they are doing. It's too late. The reputation of palm oil is so poor in the European Union that consumers are, not all of them, of course, but a large share of the market is saying we don't want any palm oil in our baskets. And even if people come with saying, but I have sustainable palm oil, and you can check, but then it's too late. I mean, palm oil is identified as a dangerous and harmful product, whatever production is made. So that's what you don't want to happen for any kind of production. So I agree with Paulo that you have to start with the producers and having them on board and changing their behaviors. But then we have to swiftly try and reassure the consumer, and that also can go along with in marketing, let's say, going into a higher segment of market. I mean, the prime cut, the part of the meat that we buy to Brazil, for example, is the best part. I mean, it's and there is a market for good quality products that are bought by the second half, the healthier half of the population. That's a good client, let's say, for the meat industry. And I would consider that there might be some alliance between environmental protection and this kind of increase in the quality of what is sold. And I also believe in it for Europe and for France especially. I mean, I think our interest in the long run would be to invest in high quality agriculture and products rather than trying to be competitive with industrial producers that will always be cheaper than you. And I think that's, in the long run, that's a better race to run.
Excellent, Jan. Thank you, Paulo. More questions coming here. Let me start with you now, Jan. This is another interesting one, but I would also like to hear your thoughts, Paulo, on this one. It comes from Iago Rairon. In your perspective, what should be the advocacy points civil society should prioritize when engaging with EU parliaments and countries? Jan, in other words. How can we get more involved?
That's a very interesting question. It's a very good one. I think the most important is the people that live in the Amazon, and the human rights attached to it. That is, people care for first for humans and for the people that live there. So the first subject that is a concern for let's say the part of the European Parliament that is concerned by deforestation is about people that live there and the civilization that's attached to this land. Second, of course, is the protection of a huge treasury for the whole region and for the whole planet. That's of course very, very important. That's and last, but that's also important for the consumer, much less for the parliamentaries. Last is the health issues. How can we ensure that the meat we're going to sell and buy is produced without any harm for the health of the consumer, for the producers, etc. That's my third answer. But let's not forget, yes, in the advocacy, that it's not, let's say, it's not only European concern for the trees against the economic interest of Brazils. It's people, or it's people we care for. It's people that live there. I know that there are not so many, but still, we're talking of 100,000 people, and there are this very specific part of humankind, a whole civilization, a whole vision of the world, which is a treasury as much as a species are, and this is, I think, very important in our discussion.
Same for us, Jan. I mean, it's a little more. It's like 500,000 to 600,000 indigenous people living in the Amazon in about 160 different ethnies with more than 200 languages. So it's an enormous patrimony that not just Brazil, I think mankind has. You know, we have the opportunity to see groups that are living the same way that our civilized communities have lived 10,000, 20,000 years ago. So this is unique. The Amazon has more than 30, 40 indigenous groups that have never been contacted, and that has to be observed with a lot of care. So, but going back to you, Paulo, now, and please your take from a Brazilian Amazonian NGO and civil society organization. Please complain, Paulo.
Actually, I'm going to begin from the European side, because the day the agreement was signed, I was in Brussels. I wasn't there because of the agreement. I was talking with...
You're drinking beer, or you're working in Brussels?
I was working. I went to a seminar, but I have a partnership there with firm that is very well connected with Parliament and everything. And so we went to the European Parliament, and they were holding sessions with the new MPs, what they call the members of Parliament, that had been recently elected. So it's a kind of training sessions, right, discussions, the new MPs and the staff. And it was amazing to see the amount of young people and women, especially, that had been elected by this green wave. So this is what is there in the Parliament. You know, this it's not only then, but this is a change, and that was part of a change overall in Europe. Maybe there was some greater effect in the election. So there's a new, and I think many Brazilians don't get that. The transformation that is going on in terms of value, the changes in value, new generation. The greater generation and younger people, they have been studying climate change since they're in school, in child and high school, university, and they are tired. There is no change or significant change, and they see, I'm fed up. I'm going to run for election, and I'm going to try to make some change. So I think some Brazilians don't get that, and this is part of the force that is against what Brazil is doing. But in that same day, I saw other MPs, and one that was older, from Britain, and we talked, and she said, well, what this agreement is going to do is going to create a tacit cooperation between the Greens, between the agribusiness, and the fascists, she said. The Greens, of course, because they are concerned with human rights and green. The agribusiness, because some of them fear competition, but some of them, they see that is unfair because they have to implement several new policies because of climate change. And they see, well, Brazil is not doing that. And also in terms of agrochemicals, right? They see, we have all this regulation and we are going to buy products from these guys that are not doing the same. So they have this, and they say, well, the fascists, they don't like foreigners anyway. And she said that, and she was very experienced. And actually, we have seen that. What Brazil is doing is providing the basis for that combination of these three lines of thinking and values. And this is, and because of that, I think the agreement is unlikely to pass in Parliament because of, and actually, it's not only the European Parliament, but also the member states, because the Parliament has to approve, but every member state, each country, the Parliament has also to approve. And this transformation also happened in each member state. So I think there is appetite in terms of advocacy for these three kinds of arguments. And Brazil is providing all the information in terms of it has increased deforestation, it has increased the conflict with indigenous peoples, and also the more agrochemicals. So I'm not a specialist in that, but just seeing the numbers, people say, well, what's going on there? So I think those are the kind of the issues that call a lot of attention there.
Thank you, Paulo. And I hope you have loved the beer. They have good beer in Belgium too. So it's, and I wish to drink more Belgian beers, by the way, with the trade agreement. So I have personal interest in the agreement, Jan. It's a pity, friends. This is conversation. We could go on and on and on. I have so many questions, questions coming, questions circulating in my mind. We could stay here for hours and hours, but unfortunately, we have a hard stop in about 5-6 minutes. So let me ask you one question again, and I please would like you to answer in 1 to 2 minutes so that we can finalize the event. It's a question that came from Claudia Azevedo Ramos from the University of Pará, professor at the University of Pará. How much can the EU-Mercosur agreement be blamed for a potential increase in deforestation? What is the responsibility of the producing countries? What would be your take on this one? Ian, let's start with you, then Paulo, and then we finalize, unfortunately. Yeah,
short answer will be 5%. That is again, if the whole meat produced, cattle meat was produced to feed the European markets in relation with the deal, if all this meat was produced in the Amazon or in the Cerrado forest, it would be a 5% increase of deforestation in Brazil and in Argentina even more. That's a short answer. I think you needed a short answer, and that's a short one. But of course, it's a maximum risk. It doesn't mean that it would actually bring this amount of deforestation. It would depend very much on the policy implemented, but it's a maximum risk.
Thank you, Jan. Paulo. Yeah, so as Jan said, he calculated the maximum. What our report shows is kind of what is expected considering several factors besides the beef. So it will tend to be lower. But I think one thing that is important to pay attention is besides the actual change in prices, I think the agreement also could be a kind of signaling if it were to be approved now, it would signal that it's okay. What's happening in Brazil is okay. And that, I think, would be a bad signal that could have other consequences in terms of increased deforestation for the Brazilian market, for the Chinese market, and other markets.
Excellent, folks. Once again, it's a pity, but at some point we have to end the conversation. I think I've learned a lot. I think excellent report, Paulo, and very important and timely report at this point in time, because we are in the final rounds of the negotiation of the final rounds of the agreement itself, and I think raising the awareness of Brazilians, of Argentinians, of Europeans about the consequences, the positive, but also the potentially negative consequences, so that once again, Ian, as I said, we can push the button of cooperation to fix these problems. And once again, I think that's the beauty of this agreement, is that it creates spaces and it creates opportunities for negotiations. It creates opportunities for cross learnings. I mean, the Bible of sustainability, despite what some would say, it's not written yet. The manual is still under revision. So we are building the sustainability of the businesses, the sustainability of the countries, of the families, of the individuals as we speak. So it's very important that we have, from both sides of this agreement, both the Mercosur and the EU, open ears, open minds. So we are building something that may influence the future generations, as Paulo was saying, the millennials, Paulo, these kids. I just learned this morning that these kids, which are up below 30 years old or something, I mean, the younger generation, they're going to inherit $40 trillion over the next 2 decades. So these individuals, they have a completely different mindset. They have a completely different set of elements that they use to make decisions, to buy things, to invest. And we always say the financial sector as a monster, but the financial sector is us. Is small individuals, families, individuals, schools, professionals that are depositing their funds in the bank, that is grouping all together and making investments and return to the small investors the money. So and these decision-making processes in the coming decades will be completely different, because the priorities has changed. The criteria for selecting good investments has changed. It's not only the interest, the interest return, the return on the investment. Is more than that. It's the quality of the investment, the output, the outcomes of the investments has to be taken care of. So I would like to appreciate, the moment that we have had together. Jan, always an honor to have you on board of our meetings and to engage with your expertise, your knowledge, and your intelligence. Paulo, forever, my good friend, it's a pleasure to be here again with you and to learn from your findings and your discipline into organizing information and providing information to everybody, so that we can do better tomorrow than we did today. So my deepest appreciation. I can't close the section today without inviting you for the next one. The Amazon Year is going to have a third section, a third event on the second week of December. At that time, we're going to be talking about international timber trade and the Amazon, between illegality and sustainable development. Today was beef. The next one is going to be timber. Timber is a very important issue. Paulo Barreto will agree with me. He's been studying timber industry in the Amazon for the last, for the last several decades. And I'm sure that we're going to have a good conversation in a couple of weeks. So, Ian, thank you so much. Paulo Barreto, an honor to have you two here at Amazon Year with IPAM. So thank you all for the audience, and we'll see each other again in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much. Have a great day, evening, and morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Jan. Ciao, Paulo.
Ciao.